Hi, my name is Madhuri Ramesh and I teach at the Azim Premji University. I'm actually an ecologist by training. So it was an interest in island ecology and history that got me to explore food, and also because it's one of the most interesting nature society intersections to look at. The reason I was particularly interested in this invitation was the emphasis it placed on making the work accessible to a large audience. Of late, I've been working in the Andaman Islands, where actually a lot of the island youth don't really know too much about their own landscape. So I was very interested in your focus. So I've been working in the Andaman Islands for quite a long time in fits and starts. And this project came about because I had, like I said, there are a lot of island youth who didn't really know much about the islands themselves. Unfortunately, they all read the same standard kind of textbooks and everything. And it appeared that the researchers from outside, a lot of people like me, were far more well informed on what was island history, geography, and culture than many times the young people we met. The second reason was that I also had done quite a lot of work on fisheries and fishing resources, the Andamans being an archipelago, and we found again that these studies typically interview men all the time about how much fish they catch and how they catch, so you don't get a sense of what the women's knowledge of marine resources is at all. The third thing I was finding, much to my horror, is that with the passing years, there has been much more tourism and a mad influx of paneer and chicken into the islands. People there are eating lesser and lesser fish and local bhajis than they used to. And yeah, so a combination of all of these things really came together and fermented this project. Sudha, if you could please scale up. Yeah, so we decided to take a foodways approach. And one of the things I was very determined to do when I started this was to have a research collaborator who is an islander youth herself. So my collaborator, Chandrilekha, is actually from one of the settler communities in the islands, and I'll just talk about them in a little bit. And she had some training in zoology. So for me, one of the most fun parts of this project was watching Chandrilekha discover island culture and island food, because she hadn't traveled around the Andamans much herself. And it was really fun to watch, that light go on in her eyes every time she stepped into do field work. The next one, please. So the Andamans are super interesting because even if you look only at marine resources, there are mangroves, coral reefs, and fish from deep sea fishing. So you have these very different kind of marine resources that are used. And it's an incredibly multicultural society because they have had waves of migration since the 1800s from the British colonial times onwards. And if you could just go to the next slide. What happened very briefly is that, yeah, from the late 1700s to 1857, you had one of the largest migrations of people happening, being moved to Port Blair as a penal colony. And these people also were sometimes circulated within what were called the Strait Island settlements. So Singapore, Penang, Kuching, and Port Blair were all interconnected. And there's a very interesting parallel history of food traveling through, because these people were often sentenced for life. And the only connection they had to the homeland was through food and memories of food. Being prisoners, they couldn't visit, they couldn't have visitors, there was no way they were going to travel back in those times. So food was the only connection. And there's very interesting recipe books from all of these places, which look at how people adapted locally available ingredients to make things that reminded them of home. So I'm going to quickly move on and say that unfortunately, though there is a very interesting indigenous population in the islands, access to them is off limits. So our study looked only at the settler population, which is itself fantastically diverse. So for instance, you have people from all what were called the United Provinces earlier, most of central India, Telugu, Tamil, and Mopla people who are specifically brought in to improve the fishery sector in the islands. Then the Bengalis who came both from the partition wars and later. Then a community of very small Burmese migrants who were brought in as forest laborers, they call the Kirin. And also a group of people from the Chota Nagpur region who basically Adivasi in origin, but who are known in the Andamans as the Ranchiwalas, because they were all recruited through the Catholic Labor Mission Bureau in Ranchi during the colonial times. So what we did was, yeah, speak to women in all of these communities, and many of them readily let us use their real names and locations. And we produced these recipe books with bits of oral history of what the women remembered of their own families and how they had moved around. And we did it in both Hindi and English. And the title From Sea to Surva, Surva is one of those sort of pan-island, pan-community things that people make out of fish. It's a tamarind-based gravy. And though you would think, it's a very typically Tamil kind of a formulation, everybody on the islands eats machi surva. And that seemed to be quite an interesting story of how, again, identity is reconstructed when people migrate. And what does it mean to say I'm an islander vis-a-vis I'm from this place or that place on the mainland? Because like I said earlier, these were penal colonies, and people will always introduce themselves as I'm an islander. And only when you probe further do you actually figure out which part of the mainland their earlier generation might have come from. And if you could just go to the other one. So the other thing we did, apart from the Hindi and the English books, we had community meetings with the women, especially who had contributed, and we shared back these copies. Then our communications team also did this short set of Insta posts. I'm afraid I'm quite a dinosaur when it comes to social media, but they were very excited when they were designing the book, and they did these posts as well to get other urban audiences to engage with the book. Yeah, and then if you could just skip. Yeah, so these are photos of the community meetings, and one of the really interesting things that happened is that the picture on the left is actually of the Keren Craft Center, which is in Middle Andamans. This is a women's collective in the Middle Andamans, and they also have a small slow food restaurant there. And they had kind of, gone into hibernation post-COVID. And then this discussion of the book sort of revived interest. And they said, oh, we must go back to cooking those recipes. And they get quite a decent tourist crowd there just, to eat Karen food. They also organize food festivals within the village and a market system. So we hosted a meeting in that center, and during that meeting also they decided to make only Karen food and give everybody. So there were these interesting overlaps with other initiatives that were happening in the islands as well. And a lot of the Port Blair-based restaurants or tourism-related outfits are also run by the more urban, elite, and educated people of the islands. And surprisingly, to me at least, I wasn't expecting that. They were very excited. They said, yeah, I mean, we're just tired of seeing restaurants serve all these, mainland food here. And this might be a good way for us to also think a little more deeply about how to showcase islander food to tourists and not just let it be two very separate things. So these were some of the sort of interesting spin-offs. And we're still thinking about, what else we can do, which is why I was very excited to receive your invitation. Thank you for having me here.